Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tina Campton, and as one of the co-organizers of the conference, it is my pleasure to welcome you all back and to reconvene for our afternoon sessions. This morning's panel, for those of you who were here, you already witnessed that, but for those of you who were not, it really did set the stage in intentional ways for the rest of the conference, but also for these two panels in particular. Our first session focused our attention on understanding the city, or cities more generally, not as mere geographic locations, but as complexly peopled places, places of belonging and unbelonging that are fractured and reconfigured in and through catastrophe and its afterlives. Ariella Azoulay urged us to engage disaster as an ongoing process that continues to circumscribe the lives of urban residents. Saskia Sassen, on the other hand, asked us to look more closely at the political possibilities that the powerlessness wrought by urban violences might engender. And Karen Till put memory and the memory work of individuals and communities at the center of the process of imagining some of the alternative futures that might emerge in the aftermath of trauma and injury. Yet the question that we face as scholars, as artists, and activists is, how do we access and engage those memories? It's this question that lies at the heart of the work of the September 11, 2001 Oral History Narrative and Memory Project. Our two afternoon panels are devoted to the memory work of its narrators and the oral historians who assembled their stories. Please join me now in welcoming the director of the Columbia Center for Oral History, Mary Marshall Clark, who together with her colleague Jerry Albarelli will be moderating our first panel. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tina, and I want to express the deepest thanks to my co-panelists, our narrators, Zorha and Talat. And for me, it's a circle, I think the circles of belonging and unbelonging were the perfect way to kick this off and to start, because in reality, that's what we explored, and we have two wonderful people to explore that with today. I think I'd rather stand. Hello? Okay. So I wanted to give you a brief introduction of what we did, what our work was. I say we, and when I say we, I mean 30 interviewers, some who were paid and some who refused to be paid, one of whom is in our audience, Ann Svekovich. I'm so glad to see her here. And just to give you a background on the project so you have a sense of its scope. Several days after the events of September 11, 2001 in New York City, I was introduced to Peter Behrman, the sociologist, then and now head of the Institute for Social Economic Research and Policy, ICERP. And together we, the Columbia Center and ICERP, began an oral history project that eventually culminated in 1,000 hours of conversation with over 600 people taken over time between 2001 and 2005. We were looking for answers to certain questions, and we thought we might be able to find them quickly. Was 9/11 the national story going to collapse the urban stories of New Yorkers, so attached to their global roots and global futures? Would 9/11 really be the national and militaristic turning point in New York that it was claimed to be in the rest of the nation? Would New Yorkers fall in step with the rest of the nation so quickly accepted the government's rationalization of not one, but two wars? Would those who experienced such extraordinary suffering in Lower Manhattan be able to support the killing and maiming of other innocent people in their name? And soon later we would ask, would New York fight against the xenophobia that swept the nation from shore to shore and even infected our own communities? We had the hubris to think that these questions could be answered quickly. We were soon humbled. One story led to another and another in our efforts to understand the complex and diverse subjectivities that informed each life history we took and every community we worked in. We interviewed a huge range of people, iron workers, restaurant workers, poets, taxi drivers, street vendors, paramedics, psychologists, teachers, Muslims that worked at the Trade Center, Muslims in detention, and Muslim and Sikh and Arab leaders who were forced to account for who they were then and in the years that followed. We talked with nearly 80 Latinos, mostly from Mexico, who soon began to leave in the political aftermath that ensued, as well as politicians and diplomats trying to negotiate the huge national tensions that ensued between this country and other countries in the world, especially the Middle East and South Asia. We learned over the 5 years in which we did our active field work, in which we talked with 600 people, that really what we were gathering was cultural and social difference rather than sameness and agreement. So this difference became the norm rather than, and in contrast to, stark contrast to, the idea that 9/11 meant one thing for all people. When we went to Queens to interview immigrants, Muslims, Arab Americans, and Sikhs, we found that the FBI had traveled there before us, moving people into detention or deportation jails. When we stood on unemployment lines and followed people back to their homes in the Bronx and Chinatown, we saw the aftermath of 9/11 on people living at the threshold of poverty, fighting to bring back their family businesses and their community centers. When we talked to artists, we found the traces of injury transformed in new creative work, and we have Zora Sayed, an artist, with us today. An artist we don't have, Brian Conley, who lost his studio and his son-in-law on a plane on the day of 9/11. We don't have because he has gone to Afghanistan, where he's raised money to start an art studio to help rebuild an art college to help rebuild the studios of artists whom we bombed. As we listened to everyone, we only found one pattern of similarity. Almost everyone we interviewed spoke in a language that rejected the official and simplistic 9/11 language of war and revenge, and superseded the flat and narrow ways in which the mass media rendered 9/11 in the public imaginary. What we found over 10 years were people struggling to find meaning. The struggle for meaning was as important as the meaning itself, and struggling to make sense of their own personal experience against an orchestrated consensus and response. Watching this struggle and being a part of it led us to continue our work long after we thought it would be done. These voices, ones that we took from the collective conversations that simmer beneath the public surface, are the ones we return to you today. For in fact, they belong to the city, not to us. We hope that they are the voices through which New Yorkers will remember over time and through time, telling and performing and retelling again until the real memory breaks through, urgently, defiantly, reclaiming the public sphere as its own intimate and infinite space from which new imaginaries, new creations, and new publics will be born.
I wanted to say a few opening remarks of my own. We have with us today, can you hear me? We have with us today two women, Zora Sayed and Talat Hamdani, who refused to be silenced, or who refused anyway not to be heard, and who have complicated our understanding and the public's understanding of the events of September 11th and their still unfolding consequences. I want to say a word or two more before turning this over to them about how these collaborations, and we think of these interviews as collaborations, worked. What we recorded amount to spoken autobiographies. Here is more or less how we did it. We asked them to paint their stories on a broad canvas, to conjure up the past in an attempt to understand the present. We asked modest, open-ended questions in response to which we expected to hear, and often did hear, the longer the better, surprising answers. We told them, this is your story, you will be driving this interview, we won't be, and we meant it. We asked them to address the present, but not the way journalism does, more the way literature does, and at the same time to address the future, because we were operating on the assumption that the future might have a completely different set of questions in mind, and that the answers to those questions might be hidden or implicit in the complex stories we were recording. We took some of our cues from literature, or we learned to. We asking them to use descriptive language, focus on scene, characters. We asked them to feel at ease with apparent contradictions. We ask that they tell stories and allow one story to lead to the next, to follow the story's lead as if it had a mind of its own, as if it knew sometimes more than the storyteller and certainly more than the story hearer. We learned to expect from the story, or to place our trust in the story as vessel to do what stories have always done best, which is to, rather than to provide easy answers, to raise difficult questions. We're so glad that they're here today so that you can have a sense of what we experience, the power of the story precisely told, its stubborn refusal to yield its final meaning, but also, 10 years later, the power of the reflections of these witnesses to history whose unofficial voices, after so many official lies, are the ones we really need to listen to.
Zora, when I first met you, shortly after September 11th, 2001, later that year, you were a PhD student at City University Grad Center. You have done so much since that time. You have helped so many people, and your work as an activist, a scholar, a poet, a publisher is something we all want to hear about. But I'd like to start like we always start. Where were you born?
Feels heavy, but
You can make it light.
okay. I part-time as a stand-up, but I was born in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. Let's not talk about the year.
Excuse me?
So let's not talk about the year.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I was born.
We won't say the year.
But I was, my family left before the war in Afghanistan. My grandmother was in Saudi Arabia, and my father had this dream of reconnecting with her. So we were in Saudi Arabia for 4 years where I grew up, and then we came to the US. So I came to Brooklyn at age 5, Sheepshead Bay. So.
And would you tell us a little bit about your family?
Sure. They were, in my eyes, a little crazy, a little sweet, a little odd, but we got along pretty well in Sheepshead Bay, I think, as far as the diversity of the community. I went to a really beautiful little elementary school, and I loved school from day one. I would wake up at 5 a.m. and get ready for school. And my dad, my mother, my brother, my sister, we were all born in different countries that we traveled in, so we were a small family. Pretty anonymous in Sheepshead Bay until I think 9/11. I think suddenly we became known, as I was known in many other places, as the Afghan. So the word Afghan developed a different meaning, whereas before they were like, "Is this Africa? It's near Malaysia? Are you in Australia?" Like they didn't know where it was. I think it was after 9/11 it suddenly became very clear that this was the Afghan. This is where the Afghans lived. So it was really shocking for us that people that we had grown up with were suddenly very hostile towards us. People were very protective of us as well at the same time. You know, you had a split. But it's interesting because nowadays I hear, I'm not in Sheepshead Bay anymore, but I hear about Sheepshead Bay being very resistant to a mosque being built, very resistant to the growing Muslim population. But in the 80s, you know, there really wasn't. In the 80s, we were actually the heroes, right? The Soviet-Afghan war made Afghans a bit of a hero in their neighborhood. Right?
Thank you for that context. It helps us understand. We talked earlier about where you were on the day of September 11th, on the Q train, as I remember. If you could just recount a bit of that, and then we'll move to the aftermath.
Yeah. I was teaching Arab American Lit for the first time at Hunter College. It was a big move, and we were all excited about it. So I was actually up early to go teach my class, and I was on the Q train.
We can move on.
No, it's okay, but it's just very present still, I think. But I was reading, and there were all these people looking out the window once we got over the bridge. The Q train goes over the Manhattan Bridge. So you see the Twin Towers, you see all of New York. It's beautiful. It's like a postcard, especially at sunset. So we were passing by, this was probably 9-something a.m., and it was on fire. I saw it on fire, and there's smoke, and everyone's up, oh, what's going to happen? But I went back to reading because I thought, New York, you don't really get up and stare at things. You just move along. You mind your own business. And I thought, oh, well, they'll just put it out. I mean, you don't really think about how, I didn't feel, I think I grew up feeling very invincible as a New Yorker. So you feel like, oh, someone's going to take care of it. No big deal. And we were going back into the tunnel, and the train conductor said, really nonchalant, planes went into the Twin Towers. Some of the trains have been rerouted. Next stop, Canal Street. It was very like, oh, all right, big deal. But.
And you later walked home over the bridge, right?
Yes, I walked home. Well, I went to, I walked all the way from, I didn't end up going to Hunter. I think by then we found out. 34th Street, we saw smoke, and me and a colleague walked a little bit. We were walking around with a radio that was unplugged. I don't know what we were going to do with this radio, but it was supposed to connect us somehow. We were very nervous about what was going to happen. We were near the Empire State Building. And I ended up just walking and walking and walking. And there were no trains. There was no telephone. And I walked over the Manhattan Bridge with a group of people. It was incredible how quickly communities developed. There was a leader. Someone said, come on, let's all go together here. Let's work as a group. After the bridge, people were giving us water. But the walk over the bridge, I noticed that people who didn't know each other were just coming together to just help each other and just sort of be companions on this walk, which was quite powerful. And it was very hard to see, you see the dust on the water. There was a group prayer. This guy was like, we're poor, please don't. We're hard workers, please don't attack the bridge as we're walking over it. And it was very eerie. It was all the fear. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, all these fears of, global nuclear attacks, and suddenly everyone, the highways stop and people are walking on it. It was a very frightening idea for me growing up. And that's exactly what had happened. And it brought back, it made very real the stories of the war in Afghanistan. It was some way I was like, oh, this is what it feels like. This is.
And the reason I asked about your family earlier on, which might have felt like the wrong place to ask, but the reason I ask is that later, as you told your story again and retold it to a smaller group of people we had together in 2003, you went back to the memories of your grandparents talking about walking through the city with blood on their shoes.
Yeah. It's so hard for me. I didn't realize how hard it would be. But
Okay, well, we can move to an easier subject.
Yeah, it's very, it's almost like it's a way of connecting to memory in a very visceral way. And then I think the meaning of parents, the meaning of grandparents, I don't know, it just really changed for me when you experience that kind of vulnerability. But, yeah.
So the other part of what we are all really interested in hearing is your response as an activist, a poet, a scholar, and now a publisher, and the creative worlds that you occupy and how you began to live through the aftermath, which was hard too, in that raw kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In one way, I had just started teaching college, and I didn't have any experience. How do you teach during wars? I mean, how do you teach during, after such a catastrophe about the same people who are being profiled, who are being stereotyped, and students came in with, different levels of stereotypes and sometimes anger. So it was very difficult for me to figure it out, but at the same time, I think it was difficult the first couple of days. I mean, I had to stay home the first 2 weeks because my department was very nervous about how students would respond to me. But I think what I did was I don't know how appropriate this is, but we all hugged as teachers and students, and after that, I realized the power of empathy, the power of it's okay to be emotional and reach out and to teach in a way that could incorporate humor, compassion, and literature and film and arts, which was a good way of breaking this kind of barriers between one kind of people and another kind of people. So that was one way that I think really helped me find a voice or an approach. And that emotional thing, of course, transfers into poetry, into literature, into, finding kinds of writings that would, break one, a language of victimization, another, a language of, anger, so it would really offer a much more complex, range of emotions and messages with politics and news. And, I always find that, maybe this was something that I think it's Diana de Prima says this, and where she says poetry had more news than the news. And I feel like in these gatherings of artists, in the gatherings of whether it's events that we held, or interfaith poetry and literary connections, or film even, and even classrooms, the publishing, the work, the Afghan American anthology that we ended up putting together, me and a friend, it really was about kind of learning how to take turns being in each other's space and offering that perspective of, connection. So,
Thank you. I want to ask you, something else we talked about was that you were interviewed for our project, but then we hired you to do interviews for our project. And I wanted to ask you, because you were interviewing people your age and sometimes in your group about the changes happening within the community, and just to comment in general on oral history that you've been a part of since then.
Yes, I think one of the most powerful things of this project was to be asked about your life from the beginning, not necessarily from the moment of, because I think while we're talking about childhood in these beautiful childhoods or whatever, we all have beautiful childhoods, I think, to be able to enter into what happened 9/11 was gradual and natural and holistic, I felt. And I like to take that approach. And it was excellent reaching out to my community, because I hadn't, our community is very, we were a young community, I guess, or new. And there was this idea that you didn't really talk about the things that you suffered from. So this idea of suffering and talking about it was not really appropriate, right? So you would have very polite responses to it. So it was very interesting to not only, one, record it in English and hold the interviews in English, but also to, which allows a lot more freedom, I think, of expression. And only because the native language would have all the formalities and the how should I talk? I mean, am I going to speak for my family? Am I going to speak for myself? That sort of formalities was lightened up a bit. And the interviews actually helped every work that I did. I mean, the training that I received, I worked on an arts project later, and we used the same techniques of talking about people's lives first, and then the incident, and we were able to really put together a great 10 years after 9/11, community members and poets having a conversation. But oral history was a major part of it, major part of the Afghan American anthology. I don't think I could have collected the data that I collected if I hadn't interviewed, all of these Afghan Americans and community leaders too. So it was exciting.
I just wanted to ask one final question. When we met in 2003, you hadn't written poetry for a while, because of this period of confusion and irrational guilt you felt and all of that. What were some of the transformations that happened inside of you to be able to let you to write again?
That's a tough one. I did. When there's this one moment. Let me start with that moment. It was the film of this Afghan American who had been killed a month after 9/11. And the excuse that the producer had used was that he was so angry about what had happened in 9/11 that he wanted to kill someone Afghan. The reality was much difficult, much more complicated financial issues. But that was the excuse used in court. And I remember when we finally got the film completed, it was Fire Dancer, and the filmmaker is Joey Dwasel. It was all over the news. I remember being in an Afghan traditional dress in front of Ground Zero. It's a Tribeca Film Festival. And I just felt a tremendous amount of guilt. And I wasn't sure how to process it. The war had started already, so there was, it was still the height of excitement for Afghans going back, right? Afghan Americans going back. Afghanistan was rebuilding, nothing could go wrong. But it was a very complex place, and I didn't know where it came from, but I did feel extremely guilty, and I couldn't articulate that. And I couldn't create art out of it because it was right in the middle of happening. I don't think I was able to write until maybe 2003. Another friend of mine was killed in Afghanistan as well, and I think that's really was the turning point for me to be able to, you're called to write about these lives, and you're called to write about your own life, not in a very self-indulgent way. This isn't like being a confessional poet and you have to write about, how you feel, but it's the history. You're not writing about yourself, but the history that brought you to this place. The history that brought me here is why I'm here speaking. I don't really think I'm a very important person, but all of the things, the generational histories, is why I feel compelled to speak, create, write, interview, because it gives me that range of possibility for lives that I didn't lead, and for people who couldn't speak for themselves. When I interviewed my father for that poetry project, I didn't know he had all of this, racism at work. He didn't talk about it. But in English, and because it was going to be performed somewhere else, he told me all of these things that were terrible that had happened. But he was very, he didn't make a big deal out of it, but it was very interesting for me to be able to connect and find that out and to connect with other lives. So.
What a beautiful place to end with the history, because now we have another really historical story to hear as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
And what a good place to start with the history, because I always say, we are interested in, we understand that posterity will be interested in knowing who exactly is addressing, who's telling the story. And so we start at the beginning, wherever you decide that beginning might be. But would you start by talking a little bit about where and when you were born, some of your early memories, some of your early experiences?
I was born in Karachi, Pakistan. My grandma was a midwife, so she delivered me. And I come from a family of 8 siblings. Both my parents were educationists, really high profile. And growing up in Karachi, Pakistan, I remember reflecting back that I always fought for my rights, and at each and every moment of my small steps moving forward in life, my liberties were curtailed because of my gender. I was told not to play in the streets because I was a girl. I was told not to whistle because I was a girl. And I was told, not to talk in a loud voice because I was a girl. My mother-in-law told me that too, years later. Yeah. So my father refused to teach me driving because, he said, you're a girl. I said, is it a sin to be a girl? And so Jerry remembers I took him on a wild ride. I said, let me show you how much I know how to drive. So finally he was convinced, but before I get killed or something, he said, okay, I'll teach you how to drive, okay? And and in that country, but there's one thing that I will always be grateful to my parents. They were both educators, so they gave us the best of education. 8 siblings. I'm the youngest daughter. 4 of us are medical doctors, and the other 3 boys became different engineers. I'm the only one who took after my parents' profession. And I fell in love with my husband, and both the families were against each other, although we were both Muslims. They were from different sects, so there was a big issue for both the families. And I stood my ground, he stood his grounds, and we got married. And then we had Salman in 77 December, my first child, Salman Hamdani. And my husband was very ambitious, so he was ambitious, you know. I mean, I came from a educated family and reasonable middle class, but, you know, well off, so to say. He wanted to move forward in life, so he was able to get a visa to come to America as a journalist. He was a journalist. So he came here in 78, and I followed, you know, in February 79 with Salman, who was 13 months old, and I remember arriving at the airport, and the gentleman at the airport immigration said, how long do you want to stay here? And I said, as long as I can, because my ticket was for 4 months, so I figured, you know, as long as I can. That was the only question he asked, and he says, speaks very good English, wants to stay as long as she can. Will she ever go back? And a big question mark. And he put it in my passport and said, see that red flag room? Go over there. And that's where I ended up. I was very nervous, and Salman was crawling on the floor. Finally, they called my husband in, and he came in with, you know, his attitude nonchalant. What are you doing holding a journalist's wife? I'm going to put your name in the paper. And the officer says, yeah, here's my name. Okay, don't forget to write my name in there. And so he gave me like 2 weeks visa to stay. And we came out of the airport in New York City. And that's what I remember coming to New York. And I came to Brooklyn, New York also, Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And as a sequel to it, you know, like we had to go back to get a visa, you know, to the immigration at 26 Federal Plaza. So I went down there with my husband's friend, and he said, you know, put Salman on the counter. This is going back like how many years? 79, 30 some years ago. So it was a small window sill at the immigration. So he said, put Salman over there and pinch him. And when he cries, they will process your application very fast. And I did that, and he gave me one more advice: don't speak good English, because then they'll keep asking. So it was so difficult not to speak good English, because I'm an English major. I taught English in my country. So he said, you gotta go back. Yes, me go back, me go back. Me come husband, visit husband, me go back. And then after that, you know, we renewed our visa by mail on journalist grounds, and then we filed for, you know, immigration, and we became legal, and that's my history.
Good. Okay. We know that you lost your son, Salman, on September 11th, and I wanted to ask you to tell any version of that story that you're comfortable telling in this, and what happened subsequently.
It's tough.
Or since we know it, you can talk about what came later.
No, I want New York to hear what we went through, what I went through as a mother, what it is to lose a child who gives his life. Salman grew up, and he graduated that year in June 6th from Queens College, chemistry major, and he wanted to become a medical doctor. And he was an NYPD cadet. He did his EMT certification. So that day, it was a Tuesday. It was a very nice, crystal clear day. And my second son, Adnan, was at Binghamton. He was out in college. The youngest one was at home, Zishan. So Salman was 23, and Adnan was 19, and Zishan was 17. So we left I dropped Zishan off in the morning at 7:15, and I went to my school, Middle School 72 in South Jamaica. And when I came out of the classroom at about 10:20, 10:19, I saw teachers talking, and I said, you know, maybe the superintendent has come talking of like a raid on the school, how the school is performing, and they were talking about the towers being hit. And one tower has fallen, so I said, no, something is wrong with my hearing. Let me go and call my husband. So I went and I called him, and all he said was, my Salman is there, and he was crying. And I said, Salman cannot be there because he does not work there. Salman worked in Manhattan at Harvard Hughes Medical Institute, 65th Street and York Avenue. So I said he is not there. He will definitely go there to help later on. But at that moment, and then he said, the second tower is falling. And I found myself crying, and I said, then I remember wiping my tears, and I said, I don't know anybody who works there, so why am I crying? But that is where they found his remains in October, in 34 pieces by the North Tower. And the tragedy is that instead of acknowledging his sacrifice, the media is also not so much responsible as is I would say the NYPD. They cast suspicion on him as though he was linked with those attacks. And the way we discovered, one of the customers at my husband's store told us that there is a flyer circulating, the MTA. And he used to work for the MTA, and he informed us that there's a flyer circulating with your son's name. You better get in contact with the congressperson. So we got in touch with Congressman Ackerman. And so after 6 months, we went through, he interrogated us. There were officers who came to our house. They wanted his computer. They wanted his password. I said, you must be kidding. You expect a child to tell his mom his password? How naive. So seriously. Then after, I wrote a letter to President Bush also, and Ackerman made us write a letter to Ashcroft. So by the end of everything, after 3 weeks of interrogation, he was pretty much satisfied. And now Ackerman and we are on good terms. But they confirmed his death 6 months later, which on March 20th, which was, I couldn't understand why the delay in confirming it. Why not tell us immediately? So there was this false hope that maybe he's alive and he's detained. And actually, we got a letter because Salman also helped establish a chemistry major professor over here, his lab in the year 2000. 2000, right? So, or 2001 it was. He worked here in the summer. So let's remember getting a letter from here also that he's languishing in some cell. That's why I got, there was this hope that maybe he's at Guantanamo Bay. And it was like going through, when you have the hopes dashed again. So we had his funeral in April, and the NYPD, gave him a very nice funeral. Salman was a very, very humble, very compassionate, kind, vibrant, full of life young man. He loved children, he loved animals, and very humble. And honor to him was, we attended somebody's funeral, which was given by the police, and he said, Mama, that is honor, and that is how I want to go. That was in 1999. And 2 years later, that's how he went 3 years later in 2002. So, and because of what happened to me on a personal, level, having lost a child and who adopted this country, I adopted this country, and then to be accused of, interrogated, of being maybe a link because of what? Because of my faith. So what if I'm a Muslim, or he was a Muslim, or I am from Pakistan? It changed the dynamics of the moral values of my country here. And it made me question, why this change? And 10 years down the road, I started, 2 years later, my husband died also of grief. He just couldn't bear it, losing his, firstborn child, and he also died. And that's when Jerry had interviewed me in 2005 after my husband died. And so there's a legacy here. This is my son's legacy. Thank God I was able to redeem his, dignity immediately after when the funeral was announced. It was announced that he was it was a statement that yes, he was a proud American. He was a hero. And his sacrifice is acknowledged in the Patriot Act, which itself is a very egregious act, which has to be repealed. But slowly and surely, the administration, the Obama administration, is making those small rules very permanent now. So a lot has changed, and there's a lot of work to be done, I feel. And we need to get our country back on its moral keel again. Yes, I understand 9/11 happened. It was done by whatever 18, 19 terrorists, but they were foreigners. They were not domestic. None of them were Americans. So why is Peter King scapegoating, and 9 years later, last year was a very horrible year with the Park 51 issue. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we need to stand united as a country. It's not a Muslim issue or a Christian issue. It is an American issue. Because today it is one race or one faith, and tomorrow it will be another race and faith, So that is where I stand right now.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about you've become a very public person, and some of the stops along the way. I know I met you. You were involved with Families for a Peaceful Tomorrow.
Yes, Peaceful Tomorrows for September 11th, Families for Peaceful Tomorrows is an organization which was formed in spring of 2002 by family members who lost their loved ones on 9/11. And the mutual feeling is that, wars are poor chisels for peaceful tomorrows, Martin Luther King's statement. And also we try to, we are against violence and wars. We disagree with the 2 wars that were fought as a byproduct of 9/11. And Peaceful Tomorrows is also very active in restoring the rule of law campaign. And one of our asks is, to close down Guantanamo Bay because it's a byproduct of 9/11. And so 2002, we became members. They reached out to us. And 5, after my husband died, I became very active lobbying. We went lobbying a lot, with Peaceful Tomorrows against Guantanamo Bay and restoring the rule of law. We met with many different congressional and senators' offices. And some offices were very receptive, and some were as though we are just aliens. They would nod their head, and they would go, yeah. And then that was it, And Senator Graham's office is very, very extremely, on the other side of our platform. He's very pro-military and, all for wars and everything. So that I lobbied. And then in 2009, I think it was, after President Obama became the president, we were invited with other 9/11 victims' families to meet with Attorney General Eric Holder regarding Guantanamo Bay, and he said that categorically we will close it down. There will be 3 different types of criminals or segregations: those who can be addressed in military courts, those who can be addressed in federal courts, and some who may be just detained indefinitely. And that does not make sense to me. Indefinite detention by executive order, and right now they're trying to make it implemented in any part of the world. And I say they, I mean the White House, so the administration right now. So, and at that meeting, there were 3 of us from Peaceful Tomorrows. There were other members also, victims' families, and everybody, made a statement. And the general opinion was that the statements were all against Muslims and Islam. And then after I spoke, and some of them, toned down their hate speech, But the sentiment was there. What I experienced day 1, the sentiment was growing in the country. And then in 2009 again, later that year, I went to Guantanamo Bay itself. Although Salman was buried, everything was done, my husband was dead. It was like 7 years after the fact. But somehow I was still in denial, and when I went to Guantanamo Bay, we were flown from the Andrews Air Force Base in DC, and to Guantanamo Bay, and we actually arrived at an island, and from there we boarded a boat, and I think we were on the boat for like 45, 50 minutes, and then we came to the island itself. And the island itself was, you could see there was a very separate, segregated, and you could see, yes, it's the modern version of a dungeon, from the old stories that you read about, in the British times. But so it was the modern American dungeon version, but it was above ground, and they were very brand new construction. Only the men served over there. It was the Military Joint Force Task, JTF, Joint Task Terrorist Force, was actively defending the liberties and protecting us. And that day, that trip gave me a good sense of what our military's might is. And I had to, just came to terms with what the Pentagon means. And what did not make sense to me is that here they are trying to protect our country, right? Defend me. And the situation right now is that they're trying to defend me by taking away my liberties of due process that is still suspended under the Patriot Act. And so going back to Guantanamo Bay, I was secluded from everybody else. I was placed in a very nice modern, townhouse it was. And each officer had a townhouse to himself. Their families did not join them. They were just men over there serving. Some came for 6 months, some came for a year. And whenever I was picked and dropped, and I was always escorted. I was not allowed to wander off, step out of the house by myself. So we were there for, I think, like 2-3 days. The second day was the hearing of the 5 high-value detainees. And when we went to the hearing, we were informed that, number one, I was delayed. Somehow, in such a small island, the guy lost his way. So, yeah, right? Makes sense. So when I got there, the proceedings had started, and the judge was there, and the prosecution lawyer, Mr. Swanson, yeah, that was his name. And so the judge had asked him a couple of questions. One was, you did not give me this information. I've been requesting it for the last 2 times. And he said, I will look into it, Your Honor, and make sure you get it. And then there was one very peculiar question. The judge said, I had ordered you to give these 5 detainees a transcript of what transpired in the previous hearings in their own language, whether they spoke Afghani or whether they spoke, Urdu or Iraqi language, I don't know. So he said, I ordered you to give it to them, and as yet you have not given them. So his response was, they all speak very good English, Your Honor, so I'm not going to do that. So he was very belligerent and very, challenging. But the detainees did not come out, and at the over there, 2 of the detectives, I was told to go and talk to them. So I went over there and spoke to them. And they said, Ms. Hamdani, your son Salman is really dead. He's not here over here at Guantanamo Bay. And my take was, fine, he died. But the people that we are holding incommunicado, they are somebody's children. They are somebody's brothers. And they are somebody's husbands or fathers. And that is not right. Inform them. But this is going back 5-6 years ago. Now we have a very few amount of people, few number of people living over there. So I came back from Guantanamo Bay. That was a very, educational trip for me. And then the next important milestone, I would say, in my life was when I heard that Peter King is going to have hearings on radicalization in the Muslim community. And we approached from Peaceful Tomorrows for him to give us a meeting. So after hounding him for 3-4 weeks, he finally gave us a meeting in DC. Although we were all in New York, he's in New York, he made us travel all the way to DC. So 3 of us traveled, and as we approached his office, he walked out saying that he has a meeting, and we never got to meet him. So he doesn't have the courage to sit down and talk to people who are advocating for peace. And, and the aide said, you want to say something? I said, I'm sorry. The congressman does not want to talk to me, and neither do I. He wants to talk, here's my card, he can contact me. And he did not contact me. So when the hearings were coming up, I said, I'm going to go and talk. I'm going to go and tell my story. Because this is not right what happened to my son. So when I arrived there, actually, the night before, Peter, what's his name? Congressman Keith Ellison had called me that, is it okay if I mention your son's name? I said, fine, you can mention my son's name. So when I arrived there, he gave me his seat, and he testified. And I'm sure if you must have heard, that he just broke down. And that was a very cathartic moment. That was, a turning point, not only in my life, but I would say in the history of our nation, on the social justice platform. That was a turning point because everybody thought that, when the whole country, especially the media, that she testified. I said, I did not say a word. It was, Keith Ellison who testified on behalf of my son. And he broke down and he left. I sat through the whole hearing, which was a charade. And and as of that day, there was a lot of emotional healing in me that took place, that yes, my son's sacrifice is now acknowledged and his name is resonating in the Congress, on the Hill. And then then summer, I was invited by the AAIP, Asian American Pacific Islanders Caucus, to testify on the Hill about what happened. And SALT also, I testified on the SALT committee also. And then after Osama bin Laden was taken out, retribution, President Obama invited us, to meet him. And that was a very, the most healing moment in my life, because some people, they say, we don't like Obama. I said, fine, it's not about liking or disliking Obama. For me, it was a moment that, yes, my president has invited me to speak with him, which means he is standing in solidarity with my pain, be it 10 years later. But he is acknowledging my pain and my son's sacrifice, and through him, it means that my country, my fellow Americans are with me also. So that was a very, high point in my life. And somehow over these 10 years fighting for my sons, getting him justice, I was just looking at Facebook, and 2 years ago I wrote, I will be your voice and you will be my strength. And 2 years later, that's how it is. He is my strength. And to me, he is not dead. He is, I feel he's back in me. His energy is all back in me. And I'm fighting, somehow I've become, like Jerry said, a public person, and a voice for the community. And there I've met a few, quite a few activists now. I'm very happy to see that 10 years later, a new generation has grown up, and they are fighting for their rights. And yes, so I've become a public person, I agree, and because of what happened to me, because other Muslims died too, but they're not speaking. Why they are not speaking, I don't know. I would like them to speak. I reached out last year to form a Muslim 9/11 organization, but nobody responded. So it's a tough walk. It's a very tough walk, but bring what the future may, if something is wrong, I believe I have to fight. I have to speak up, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Thank you.
May I say one more thing, Jerry? I know it's ended, but the injustice, has not ended. Salman was an NYPD cadet, and I requested the 9/11 memorial to acknowledge him as a cadet, as an NYPD cadet, which they refused because they said he was not on the payroll. So I got a letter from Commissioner Kelly, and I brought it to this person, Daniel. His name is Daniel, I think, yeah. But he said, no, we have our own rules, doesn't matter. But now I just discovered that NYPD has 3 memorials, and Salman's name is not on it either. So when I met Commissioner Kelly at the Ramadan event, I asked him why is his name not on it. So he said, write a letter, and I have written a letter to him. So my struggle is still going on. I want to see his due sacrifice and his due place in history acknowledged.
As always, you are my inspiration. And I didn't realize you'd been to Guantanamo, and you are I must have known, because you're the inner voice in me that led us to create a project on Guantanamo. So we now have 100 hours, mostly with advocates, lawyers, people who resigned from the military and protest. But now we're interviewing families and people who were held there. In fact, I'm going tonight to CUNY Grad Center, where Gareth Pierce is presenting on her work with former prisoners in Britain, and the families are coming. So again, you've been the inspiration, the light that led me to even imagine that this is what we have to do next. And you are, both of you, to me, the embodiment of something we write about in oral history and probably in other genres of testimony, which is the role of the witness and the power of the witness. And I think we see here today the incredible power of individuals, that this is, that can transform, that can come up against massive institutions, the flattening of narrative from the mass media, and refuse to be, not only refuse to be silenced, but create a new way of us thinking and imagining a world in which we can act, not just respond to atrocity. So thank you.
Thank you.
Jerry, do you have any?
Oh, just thank you both. Yes, thank you. And thank you all.
So we have some time now that you could, those of you who would like to, we'll maybe end a little early, around 3:15, but we have some time that those of you who are motivated or interested could actually participate and ask some questions yourselves, if you would like to, or make some responses. Yes, Marianne?
I have a question for Zora. You went over this very quickly, but you said that after the 9/11 attacks, you had to stay home for a while because your department was worried about your effect on the students. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Well, I had a very supportive program at Hunter, and it was actually through Asian American Studies, but they were concerned about my safety. They said it wasn't so much what I would do, but just in case students had an angry response, maybe it's best for you to stay home, which was unnecessary. I mean, that class had the most media coverage. We had radio in the classroom. We had a documentary film, What Divided They Fall by Valerie Kaur. I mean, it was most of my students from that class. And I mean, it was I mean, I understand where they were coming from, but at the same time, it was a little unnecessary too. But I mean, as you can tell, I mean, it's very hard for me to, I'm so emotional, so I think in one way it was okay, because I'd probably just come in and just start crying. But it turned into a very warm class, and since it was the first class I had taught, it affected my my role as a teacher. It affected my pedagogy. So I always bring in Judith Butler, who talks about moments of catastrophe as being that place where you create empathy and connect rather than create war, right? That really appealed to me, and I think it really affected my work and my teaching method. So, thank you.
There's a question back there.
Thank you for sharing your story and us. I have a question that is a construct that both of you spoke of when you were presenting your stories. One being religion, the other being race. Zora, as you interviewed, recalled I thought I was using my teacher voice. He was encountered because of his religion. Now, my question to both of you, in spite of all that you experienced, was, speaking to Zora, your encounter with your father's explanation of the interview due to his geographic ancestry, or was it related to his religious affiliation? And the same to you.
That's a good question. It actually was very complex for my dad because, yes, of course, his name is Abdul, so that's clearly very Muslim for him. He works at a dental lab. My dad was a dentist, and my family were like the first dentists in Afghanistan. So he had, he comes from a different place. So when he was targeted for the first time, he's like, these are dentists who are attacking him. These are dentists being racist towards him. And he was like, wait, can we talk about teeth? But no teeth. We're going to talk about where Osama bin Laden is? Okay. But the interesting thing was that it had to do with Afghanistan and the Soviets, because it was, one person was a Russian American who said it would have been better if we had stayed in Afghanistan, which was really like layers of complexity and racism, right? Another was someone who was from Uzbekistan, and my family originally is from Uzbekistan, and he was trying to, there are very sort of like, I don't know, it's Soviet-era Uzbekistan tactics of saying a person was a nationalist. It was the same as calling a person a Muslim terrorist after 9/11, right? So he had a history of, he was threatening my dad by saying that catching Uzbek nationalists, and he was going to catch my dad that way too, as a Muslim terrorist. So the historical layers of this racism was very, very complex, which goes beyond, oh, you're brown, we're racist against you. There's something, deeper, I think, or not deeper, just a longer history. So it's very interesting.
With Salman with us, I don't think it was at all geographical at all, because he grew up here. It was political. It was the NYPD who sent out the flyer, and look what's happening, what news is coming out about the NYPD breaking all those surveillance rules and violating the federal rights, civil liberties. There are cases now being filed against them. And so it was not geographical, it was religious based, definitely.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Anne. Oh, sorry.
Well, somebody else has.
It was very interesting for me to hear both of you, having read your interviews in print and then seeing you live here for the first time. And despite the fact that you both have been public people, and Talat Hamdani spoke a lot about becoming a public person, so you've had ways to craft your stories for different public audiences. I did also appreciate I feel a certain protectiveness. It was difficult even for me to be an audience member and then to watch the questions unfold, and the places where it was nice to have both Mary Marshall and Jerry say, if you don't want to answer the question, you don't have to. So this was, I think, a different kind of performance of interview than in other places. But Zora, I particularly wanted to ask you about this, having read some of the interviews you did. And one of the themes that I saw there were a lot of people, yourself included, talking about being asked to sort of perform Afghan and Afghan American identities in the wake of 9/11. And also, I think there's a particular place in the public for the family members of 9/11 victims. And so I want to ask you for your thoughts about what your ideal interview is, or what makes for a bad situation where you're being asked to testify or tell your story, and what would be better ways in which people's personal and individual stories could be told, especially in media circumstances, because I think the oral history interview is a very particular, very intimate one, especially because of the long form. But it strikes me that one of the stakes of that of the 9/11 Oral History Project at Columbia is also to intervene in the ways in which often media interviews are very superficial in the way that they use people's stories. And I wonder how each of you have tried to negotiate that in order to be able to tell your stories in the way that you want them to be heard.
Well, I'll just start with a really funny story. I was, well, I think that when you're a writer in New York, everyone thinks that if they promise you this possibility of maybe somewhere being published, like they got you, you know, they'll do anything they want. So I'd been asked, I was introduced to all these wonderful writing possibilities and writers and very famous ones now, and then pulled back and said, well, if you can be our Afghan woman, being an Afghan woman isn't being me, right? It means being, you know, in a burqa and be willing to have that burqa pulled off by Oprah or anyone else. And it means talking about the story of the typical refugee story. And I didn't have that story. I mean, I joke and say I'm a refugee from one air-conditioned place to another because I was really lucky. I mean, I was in Saudi Arabia. It wasn't really that bad. So, I mean, I was lucky. I had, you know, family go through much more difficult things, and I'm very grateful for that. But when when you bring community and you interview people and you could talk and write about them, that's something else. When you're asked to be the Afghan woman, then it's really offensive. So I did what any Brooklyn girl would do. I mass emailed every single person this person who invited me knew, and I just said, I will not be da-da-da-da. Thank you for your offer of XYZ, but I will not be taking it. But, you know, Canadian BBC, wait, no, it's not BBC. They wouldn't be Canadian. CBC, which was a weird, really strange place because it's progressive, and you're very excited about being on it. When we did something with the Afghan American Anthology, they invited us to be on. Me and my friend Sahad Muradi co-edited this anthology, and they asked us to be on. But when we read our poems, because we didn't have accents, they decided to take South Asian women with accents, I think one was Arab descent, to be our voices. So hearing the story of growing up in Brooklyn from, I don't know, much older, it was just very weird. So, and then to package that as a CD to sell with a picture of a dirty little Afghan kid, a poor kid, but I mean, that's what they were selling. And we got our lawyers after them. We were like, no, you can't process this. And then have Zora Saeed be, you know, I don't know, my aunt. Not even from the right continent or geographic space. But those things were very frustrating, but funny. Good stories to tell.
Well, I gave numerous interviews, you know, since last year for this, you know, 10th anniversary, and name it, you know, all the channels, you know, even National Geographic and Frontline, everybody. But where I stand right now, I do not want to talk about that day at all, because it pushes me back. It's not good for my mental health, pushes me in depression. Yes, but that is it has given me a cause, a passion to fight for. You know, fight for justice. And I look forward to how I can, you know, achieve, you know, be more effective in trying to restore the rule of law, and more importantly, this suspicion and scapegoating, the McCarthyism type of a environment that has been created by some politicians, you know. I will definitely be more involved with that. And moving forward, try to pull away. You know, it'll be a long struggle, but piece by piece, little by little, we should be able to, you know, break down the phobia that has been created against all the Muslims. You know, so that's where I see myself. And what experienced 10 years ago is not fabricated. You know, it is hard document. I mean, when Peter King's testified, when Keith Ellison testified, Fox 5, they tried to deny because Fox 5 is the parent company of New York Post, because the Post had the article, you know, missing or hiding. Yes, we went to Mecca to pray, you know, in October 11th, because we didn't know where Salman was. So they all came to my house, and I said, what brings you back to the house? So they told us there's a flyer circulating. So everybody else, the New York Daily News, the Newsday, and Times, they wrote very factual, you know, the family has gone to pray, and hopefully, you know, they're emotionally, they need healing. But Post wrote, you know, missing or hiding. And then he was seen at 11 a.m. at Midtown Tunnel. He left home with the Quran in his hand that day. Seriously, I have that article. And people are saying, you know, he's not to be found at the rubble, but, you know, he has police ID. And that's what the flyer said. Wanted, hold and detain, has police ID, chemistry major. So, you know, I experienced it, and it was my child. There was no way I'm not going to speak up. And now it's coming down to the whole community. It's not only simply religious, it is race-based, you know, Arab race, religious, and ethnicity. So it's very complex. And it will take decades to, you know, restore. And like yesterday, you know, I was a substitute teacher, and one kid goes, yes, Talat is the secret wife of Osama bin Laden. I said, yeah, Jerry, you know his name is Jerry too, sorry. Sure. So I said, there's a secret only the family knew. So I mean, I face it, you know. It's still there. And these are kids who are 14, 15 now, so they were 4, 5 when 9/11 happened. So where are they getting this information from? It is inducted by the media. And, you know, I mean, like Murdoch and Peter King, if they are not happy, they don't belong in America. Go back to Ireland and go back to Australia.
Okay, we have one last question, I think. Yes. Or two.
Tina's going to be bypassed again.
You touched on it in both of your last comments, and this is a follow-up to Anne's question, which is that what I'm struck by is the fact that memory is work, right? Memory is not just about recounting something that happened, but it's work. And in terms of the work that you're doing for us and the work that your interviewers have done, I'm wondering if you notice, having told your stories over and over again, any differences in telling it over time. So from that point in 2001 to this point. And I would love to hear from Mary Marshall and Jerry as well about what do you hear that changes or that doesn't change, and when you're telling your stories, what changes do you experience in doing this kind of memory work with us?
Great question.
For me, it's that it changes. It is a growing process, and the dynamics of our country is changing. So, and like I said, it changes, and I feel myself, you know, and in the last 1 year, a lot of healing process has taken place, a lot of awareness. I've become a lot aware of many different issues and the complexities. So it changes with time, and every 3 months, I think, there are events happening, or maybe I'm educating myself, but it does change. And sometimes I speak to, I gave interviews, and it was from different perspective, depending on what they wanted to ask. So yes, you have to not change the story, but it depends what the interviewer wanted to question. Like the Japanese were very interested in the discrimination and their similarities to the Second World War, post-American Second World War issues. And National Geographic just did on Salman, how he grew up, everything. So yes, I feel a change in me every 2-3 months, because of what's happening in our political spectrum across the country, I think, And people say I've become a politician. No, I'm not a politician. It's just that this issue is so close to my heart that, it's not a political issue for me. It's a cause for me. It's a mission. And that's how I feel, it's very different for me.
For me, I think it's different genres of telling. One, telling it in a more humorous way. A lot of the material that we're publishing, Upset Press is the independent press. So it's all about community work for me, bringing multiple voices, whether it's anthologies, collaborative performances, and art things, or publishing other writers. It's been trying to bring a little humor and maintaining the dark moments, not shying away from it, but a kind of a dark humor has grown amongst the generation, my generation, who's sort of grown up here and articulate. So it's kind of interesting to see articulate in writing or in film or in absurdist video art or whatever it is, right? So one project has been to tell it differently or tell it askew, right? The other way for me personally to tell it is poetry is a different thing. It's not necessarily from a literate place for me. It's from music and rhythm and images, and it's a different way of telling and performing and voice and breath. And then telling it this way, I always feel very awkward. But and then writing it academically or writing it, as an intro for a textbook. I mean, it's really different genres of telling, and I don't think any way is an easy way, right? So.
In terms of listening, I think it's a mark of, well, I've been watching Zora for 10 years, so it's a long time at her age in life now. And in the beginning, the stories were so haunting, and there still are, of course. And there were so many things we talked about extra to the interview in private spaces, about families, about brokenness, about fear. I could see the fear, I could see the guilt. And today when we met, we've been in touch, I guess not for the last couple of years, and today when we met for lunch, we exchanged ideas about juices we should be drinking to improve our immune systems. And she's teaching me, because she's further advanced than I am. And there's a way in which there is an increased lightness. There's a way in which both of these incredible women have pushed back against the silence and really broken it because they're trying to educate audiences to listen. The plight of people who are perceived as, in the global way, as terrorists, whether Arab Americans, Muslims, Sikhs, whomever it may be in this country, has not really changed or diminished. But the voices that we hear today on the stage have grown stronger and stronger, and it gives you, the audience, the right to speak up for them and with them, and to learn about healthy things to eat and drink.
I would just add that this whole process, it's all about the process. And so the past is a kind of country that we visit from a different vantage point and in different ways on different days. And yet there are some things that remain the same. But what I've noticed and what seems to have changed in your story is that you seem stronger. And at the same time, still determined to tell. And people do feel protective, and I feel protective, and I don't want to make any kind of spectacle of anybody's grief. But it's a difficult story, and it is your choice, and because we have given you this opportunity, and you've chosen to take it, and we have said you are driving this interview, and we mean it. I really admire your ability. And to balance, too, grief and humor. You started with humorous stories about the past. People know a lot about storytelling and what they're doing, and we need to give them credit for what they know as storytellers. And what it sort of stirs up in me, and I think is important that it stirs up in any oral history interviewer, is my own memories. Because I'm asking you questions based on empathy, based on my, what information I have and my own intuition that you sort of spark through your humanity.
I think that's a nice place to close. And please be back at 3:45 because the conversation will be enlarged to include a performance of some of the stories that were collected after September 11th. Thank you.